Welcome to San Joaquin Spotlight, a public affairs program featuring conversations about life in the central San Joaquin Valley. This program is brought to you in partnership between KFSR 90.7 FM and CMAC Fresno. I'm your host, Sevag Tatiosian. Today we're going to be talking about academics with Dr. Sergio Lapuerta from Fresno State. Dr. Lapuerta, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Sevag.
So what do you teach at Fresno State?
I teach Armenian studies, primarily Armenian literature and Armenian history, and an introduction to Armenian studies. But I also teach a course that's out of the Department of Modern and Classical Languages and Literatures that's called Humanities 10 and Humanities 11. That's a general humanities course, again, dealing with literature.
Usually when someone's Armenian, they have the IAN or YAN that gives it away.
Right.
Lapuerta, where are you originally from?
Laporta is my father's name, and he was from Sicily. He immigrated to the United States in 1960. Sometimes we changed the name to Turian for me, Sarkis Turian, though somebody recently suggested Tarpasian, which is even better because it's a bigger door.
I'm going to put you on the spot with this question.
Yeah.
Who has the better food, the Italians or the Armenians?
Oh, I can't. Well, if you ask my wife, who is of Armenian descent, she'll say the Italian, so I'm safe to say the Armenians.
So talk a little bit about how you ended up here. I mean, in reading your bio, you've had an interesting career. You've traveled all over the world, and we have you in Fresno. So how did you end up here?
When the job opened up, I believe I received the notice about 5 years ago. I applied for it. We were living at the time in Jerusalem, my wife, and we have 2 children, now ages 7 and 5. They were young. They were -5, 3 and 1 at the time, and we didn't have any family in Jerusalem or in the immediate vicinity in the state of Israel. So we thought it was time to come back to the States. And so that we could be closer to our family. And it's, the price of a ticket, all of our families on the East Coast, the price of a ticket from California for all of us to go is about the price of one ticket from Tel Aviv to New York. So I think the motivating factor was really being closer to our families and therefore moving back to the United States for that. So when the job in Fresno came up and that it was in Armenian studies, I didn't think I was going to get it. I had never been to Fresno before. I'd been to California before, but I hadn't been to Fresno before. And though I knew Professor Kiyumjan, my predecessor, I wasn't really aware of the type of program that was here. And the description, the job description didn't seem like it was particularly suited for me, but I applied anyway. And then I received the call and was pleasantly surprised that they indeed had decided to choose me for the position.
Had you heard about Fresno before?
Yes, I had heard about Fresno. And in fact, one of our friends in Jerusalem, her family was from Fresno.
Oh, there you go.
She was from Fresno and then moved to LA, I believe, and then moved to Jerusalem. She was of Armenian descent as well. So I had heard of Fresno and I knew about it for the large Armenian community, but I wasn't aware of the importance of Fresno. Really, I can admit to that I really wasn't aware of how important and Fresno is to the Armenian imagination, other than William Saroyan's origins here, and also how much the Armenians had done here. And that has been a wonderful learning experience for me while being here, getting to know the Armenian experience in Fresno and the long history and the remarkable achievements that they've made over the past slightly more than a century.
You have a very interesting perspective because you've lived abroad, you've traveled abroad, and when you come to Fresno, we are one of the most diverse places in the nation. Do you see that? I mean, do you see that diversity?
Well, it's a little different for me because I grew up in New York. So, I mean, in New York was also incredibly diverse, although I would say the neighborhood I grew up in was mainly sort of European Catholic of one sort or another, Polish, Italian, German immigrants, but obviously on the subways every day, you saw people from all over the world. So what stands out to me usually is a lack of diversity rather than diversity. And both where I lived in Jerusalem and now here in Fresno, obviously there is a diversity of populations, which feels natural to me in that sense. So it doesn't stand out to me as though, oh wow, it's remarkable in that sense, but more it stands out in the sense that it's not remarkable to me. On the other hand, there are 3 communities in general that I think are that stand out a bit more than they have for me in my own past. One of them is the Armenian, which is very prominent here. And although it had a presence in New York as well as in Jerusalem, it's not quite as prominent as it is here. The other two are the Sikh and the Hmong population, and that diversity in the specific instance, particularly the Hmong, was novel for me. I had not come into contact with many Hmong before I came to Fresno.
Fresno State's very diverse, as you can tell. There are students from all different backgrounds. In your class, are you seeing that diversity as well?
Yeah.
And how are they relating to the topics that you're teaching them?
That is always a challenge. Obviously, I believe the original conception of the Armenian Studies program mainly catered to the Armenian population. And obviously it was assumed, I think, to a certain degree that it would be primarily people of Armenian descent who would be interested in these courses. And while we do continue to have students of Armenian descent, both the composition of those students as well as the broader student body has changed. So I may have somebody who's 1/4 Armenian, doesn't have an Armenian name at all, but happens to have one Armenian grandparent. But you wouldn't be able to tell either by looking at them or they're looking at their name that they were of Armenian descent. On the other hand, we get at least half the class being of non-Armenian descent at all. And for example, I'm teaching an Armenian literature class this semester, and in the class there are 2 people out of 30 who are of Armenian descent in the class. The rest of them are non-Armenian. And that sort of does come with its own challenges, because if you're used to teaching to an audience, to a student body that is familiar with certain aspects of Armenian culture, and now all of a sudden you're faced with a student body that may not even know where Armenia is on the map, you have to teach differently. And so it keeps you on your toes, and you have to put away all of your assumptions of what the students may know and really get back to explaining everything and trying to communicate what the subject matter is. And some of my best students in these classes have been non-Armenian, and that's been wonderful. And especially if you went to the awards dinner or you go to our awards dinners, you'll see that a good number of the people who receive fellowships and who are taking the Armenian Studies minors are not of Armenian descent at all. So that's great, just to know that we are reaching out to other members of the student body and to the other sectors of the community.
I'm going to ask you to do something difficult again,
okay,
and compare Jerusalem to Fresno. Much different communities, much different places, but talk about the similarities and the differences.
Okay, so I lived in Jerusalem for 10 years in total, and taught there at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem for 8 years. And it was a wonderful experience. Loved being there. My family loved being there. And as I mentioned why we moved back to the States. It was a difficult decision to make because we really enjoyed our life there. But for those practical and personal reasons, we felt that we were better off in the United States. And before coming out to the job interview, I hadn't been to Fresno. But one of the things that is familiar, for example, is the abundance of flowers, of blossoms that are very similar between Jerusalem and Fresno. The climate in Jerusalem is a little bit milder, but still dry, fairly hot in the summer. The evenings there are a little bit nicer in the summer because it is elevated and the temperature does drop, so that part is really lovely there. But nonetheless, you have a similar sort of flora and fauna that you have here. Also, with the presence of the Armenian community there and the large presence of the Armenian community here, there are continuities also in the diet that I'm able to get. There's several delis that I'm able to go to get hummus and labneh and lahmacun and continue sort of in that sense the Mediterranean, Middle Eastern sort of way of life that we were living over there. And so that has provided continuity for us, and that's been wonderful. So it wasn't as drastic a change as it could have been if we were coming from, let's say, Norway or something like that, which I think would be quite dramatic.
And then the food eaten in Jerusalem, is it very similar to what you're finding here? I know you talked about it being easy to find some of the Armenian meals here, but
Yeah.
how about in general, the food in Jerusalem? I mean, did you see Chinese food, or did you see...
There is. I have to say I didn't eat much. I mean, going out, there is Chinese food in Jerusalem. It's not very good. It's my experience. But of course, Chinese food for me is basically Chinese food from New York. But there are Western restaurants or European and Asian restaurants. There's Thai. There's a Korean community. There was actually a good Korean restaurant there that was there. They also have Italian food. Wherever there's a Jewish diaspora, also they've managed to bring in restaurants as well. I was thinking more of the day-to-day sort of food that we didn't actually eat out that much. We don't now either. But being able to go to the market and pick up fresh fruits and vegetables and the kind of foods that you'd be able to make at home as well are very similar. And
talk about the transportation in Fresno. In New York,
yes.
You have great public transportation. In Jerusalem, I'm not quite sure, but you'll tell us. And then in Fresno, I mean, are you able to adapt and get to places here?
Well, for me, it wasn't that big of a deal. I learned how to drive and drove in Jerusalem, which if you can drive in Jerusalem and New York, you can pretty much drive anywhere. And Fresno is really easy to drive. I can do it blindfolded. I remember, I think I've saved 5 years of my life just from the lack of stress of driving here. For my wife, it was a bit more difficult, but she never learned how to drive. And actually, we were told that there was no public transportation system here at all. Before we moved out. And the first few days I was here before she arrived, I was like, I swear I see a bus. There's a public bus system. And she did, for the first few years that she was living here, take the buses everywhere, which was a challenge. But she has learned how to drive, and that's made life a lot easier. The public transportation system in Jerusalem it's quite good. Of course, there was the added factor, or at least deterrent, that for a while buses were being blown up, and that sort of it made people hesitate from using the bus system. But in addition to a bus system, now they have a light rail that crosses the entire city. So, but I wound up driving there most often.
When I was reading your background, I was fascinated because Italian, teaching Armenian studies, but you speak different languages. I mean, you speak close to 5 or 6 different languages. How did you learn these languages? What motivated you to learn these languages, and do you use them now? The last one is a particularly good question. English, obviously, I grew up with, and then I learned French in school, and starting from an early age, and so continued with that, and can pass sort of to speak it now. Then when I was in college, even though my father is Italian, spoke Italian to his parents, or Sicilian actually, more accurately, he never spoke it with me. And so I did not learn that at home, other than a few words and phrases that I learned with my grandparents, because my mother was English and Dutch, so she didn't speak. But as I got into college and I traveled and I went back to where my father was from, went to Italy, I sort of picked up Italian along the way and continued to improve upon that, and so learned Italian. And many of my studies as an undergraduate involved sort of trying out different languages and cultures, from ancient India, through Japanese and Arabic and Tibetan. So I tried a number of different languages and cultures, and then eventually wound up with Armenian and settled on that one. But that exposed me to a lot of different language families. And of course, then living in Jerusalem, I had to pick up conversational Hebrew. I had to teach the undergraduate, I was supposed to teach the undergraduate courses in Hebrew, which sort of worked. I managed to get through some of that. But I could function in Hebrew while I was there. And of course, Armenian I had to pick up for my studies. Originally, I began with just classical Armenian, Krapar, and then picked up Western Armenian, mainly in Jerusalem, through talking with the community there and taking a couple of classes with people. In Eastern Armenian, I had taken a class with Kevork Bardakshan's group in Yerevan. We spent a summer there, and that's actually where I met my wife. So that was also a nice benefit for doing Armenian studies. What got you motivated to learning about the Armenian culture, about the Armenian literature, which you teach about, and about the history? I mean, it's rare to find an Italian who speaks all those languages and then is like an expert in Armenian things, which you really are, because you know a lot about the history and the literature. You've given lectures at Fresno State, which I've heard you on. You know a lot of stuff.
Well, I was first attracted to it, or at least pointed in that direction, when I was studying Second Temple Judaism and early Christianity, and I was doing a year at the Hebrew University as a student in between my undergraduate and graduate degrees. And a professor of mine from Columbia, who had been at Columbia, Professor James Russell, and was then had just moved to Harvard University, said, well, why don't you take Armenian? They have Armenian there, and it's very useful for that field. So I actually took Armenian, and originally to supplement the study of those two subjects, and wound up falling in love with the language. And then from there, meeting people in the Armenian community in Jerusalem, and becoming more interested then in the entire complex around not just the language itself, but the entire culture that surrounded the language. And then I pursued my doctoral degree at Harvard with James Russell, and from there just started feeling my way around different subjects in Armenian, and settled on, for my thesis, working on Grigor Datavatsi, who lived in the 14th century. And then from that, expanding into learning about the culture of that time, and then moving backwards in time to the 12th and 13th centuries, and looking at the tremendous cultural interactions and transformations that happened during that period. So that's how I got into.
For any students listening to the program, if I want to learn about history, the world's history, or even more specifically, the history of the Middle East or India, I mean, is this written in English, or do I have to learn a different language? And here's why I ask you the question.
Okay.
Because you have done a lot of research in your career. You've read a lot of books. What languages did you need to know to do this research?
Oh, well, you know, if at the doctorate level, obviously it was important that I knew Armenian, classical Armenian, and modern Armenian to read the secondary literature. Normally also at the doctoral level, they do say that you should have French and German for reading knowledge, to be able to read secondary literature written in that. It would depend upon your field. If you're working on Middle Eastern studies, you probably want to know Persian or Turkish, Arabic, as well as Armenian or Hebrew. And if you're working on Indian studies, then yeah, I would say learn a modern Indian language, but I would also encourage students then to learn Sanskrit, which is the classical Indian language that much of their culture was built around. So I'm a big proponent of learning the original languages. It gives you a perspective on the culture that you don't have just by reading in translation. And there are many works, you know, in English on these subjects if one wants to just familiarize themselves with it. But to get any in-depth, I would say, understanding of a culture, you really need to address it on its own terms and be able to understand what they're trying to say, and not just have that filtered through the person, even if it's someone like myself, not just have it filtered through me, but go back to the original sources and read them for yourselves and engage with those communities on their terms rather than constantly through a mediator.
On the topic of language, you know, I regularly hear people say, I took so-and-so language, or I took this language in high school, and what a waste of time. In your opinion, is it a waste of time to learn any language?
No, not for me, no. I don't think any language. First of all, I always tell my students that if you have to learn two languages, it should be Armenian and Hebrew or Yiddish, because you'll never starve. You can always find an Armenian or Jewish community somewhere in the world, and they'll feed you. So they're always good. They're all useful languages. But I would say any language. People automatically assume, and I think this is a perception particularly prevalent in the United States, oh, I'm no good at learning languages. Well, you learned English. And
that's a start.
That's a start, right? And it is easier once you start learning a second one to then pick up other ones, because your brain starts to see the patterns. It becomes more natural to start picking up others. But you go to Jerusalem and you have kids 7 years old, who have hardly any formal education, that are speaking Arabic, Hebrew, and they'll speak to you in Italian and in English to make sure, because they have to, because they're selling things. In order to survive, they need to speak these languages. The major problem with being native English speakers is that everybody wants to speak English, and it's very difficult to practice whatever language that you're learning with them. But I say it's an excellent exercise. It does create different neural connections in the brain. I think they've shown that. And it really allows you to enjoy a completely different perspective on these on the cultures that you may be studying or want to engage with. So I think anything that helps in communication in that way between peoples is a worthy activity.
I'm going to ask you a tough question.
Okay.
Again, I'm throwing all these tough questions at you. But, you know, they say that in the United States, students are lazy. In your experience with your other areas that you have taught at, can you say that that statement is true, or what are your thoughts on that? And I ask you because I know that you've taught all around the world, so you've seen students in Israel, you've seen them in Italy, you've seen them everywhere. So I'd like your answer on that question.
One of the differences of the American student is that the university panders to them more. Whether this is a positive or a negative thing is something that can be argued. But for example, we were just talking with someone the other day who was coming from Spain. You know, they don't have student services. There aren't student affairs buildings. You know, they're not. You know, at the Hebrew University, there weren't sports teams. Right? There was nothing about that you build student camaraderie through, you know, branding the university. There was nothing like that. There are no tutors. Right? The university doesn't provide tutors. If you want to get tutoring, find it. They expect the student to do a lot of work on their own. Now, obviously, when you do that, many students don't make it, but they're comfortable with that. And of course, in Europe, as well as in Israel, there's a much more rigorous weeding out process of students before they get to university. They start saying that students aren't capable of doing university work at a much earlier period than we do. Again, with positive and negative ramifications. So it's a very different situation in that sense. In Israel, there's the added difference in that many of my students had done army training first. You're able to postpone your mandatory army duty until after your education, but many people want to get it out of the way beforehand. And therefore, they come in slightly older. They don't come in at 18. They come in at 21 or 22. They're much more focused because they've been through, you know, all of the sort of leftovers of puberty and adolescence have been knocked out of them by the army, not by, you know, campus living. So they're a lot more focused, and I would say more serious in that sense. And again, there's also a negative to that in that they tended to be more focused and less experimental, I found.
Interesting.
Because look, I've already done my army. I don't want to waste any more time. I need to get a job. I need to get my life started, so I'm going to focus in and do my work and get it done. And so they were a lot more directed, I would think, in that sense. And it's, again, there are positives to that, and then there are negatives.
We're not saying this is good or that's bad or this is good. We're just talking a little bit about what you've seen in your eyes. Because, you know, again, like when I was reading your background, I was really fascinated because, you know, Italian, speaks all these languages, is teaching Armenian here in Fresno. So let's talk about Fresno and your visit. We're running out of time this week, but when you came to Fresno, was it what you expected?
Well, I really didn't know what to expect because, as I said, you know, it's a very different. California is very different from New York in any case, and it's almost like a foreign country in some ways. I mean, and it's different from Israel. So I didn't really know what to expect, and I said I'm going to withhold any sort of expectations. The wonderful and surprising, not because it was unexpected, but I wasn't thinking in these terms, but the wonderful aspect of this experience for me has been meeting the people. It's such a wonderful community of people here. I mean, we've had such a warm welcome within the Armenian community, warm welcome within the university community, warm welcome within our neighborhood community, so that we really feel like we belong to something. And that was a surprise. I didn't expect that coming in, a total foreigner in that sense from Fresno, with no history here, no relatives here. So meeting all of these people and really enjoying their company and learning so much from them has been a wonderful experience for me, and it's been great also for my family. So that's been like the positive part of this, I have to say. It's the highlight, just how warm and friendly people are here.
We have a couple of more minutes, so just briefly, do you think you'll end up staying here, or do you think something else might come up and you may travel and go to the other opportunity?
Well, right now the decision is partially up to the university because I'm going up for tenure this year. So if I get it, I should be here for the foreseeable future. I never like to, predict what's going to happen down the line, but this has been like I said, it's a wonderful experience working here and teaching here, and we've grown roots in this community. So, for the foreseeable future, I don't see moving anywhere else. So the only thing that would ever tempt me, again, the reason why we moved here was for family, and the only reason that I would ever think of leaving here would be also for family reasons. But that would be that's the motivating factor for those sort of decisions for me. And my kids love it here. So,
last question: how can people get a hold of you if they have questions for you? You've talked about a number of things. Can they call you and talk to you?
Yeah, you can call me at my office. That's 278-4997, area code 559. So that if they have questions, they can also send emails. You can look us up on the Armenian Studies Program website, and all the contact information is listed on the website. And you can also check out all of the wonderful things that we're doing, and look at what we're doing in the Hai Sharjum, which is a great student newspaper, as well as what we're doing in the program. Busy month, and it's been a busy year, just like all the others.
Dr. Laporta, thank you so much for coming
on the
program.
Thank you,
That's all for this edition of San Joaquin Spotlight. My name is Sevag Tatiosian. Thank you to the volunteer crew that made this production possible. Thank you to 90.7 KFSR FM in Fresno. Thank you to CMAC in Fresno. And most importantly, thank you to our guest this week who talked to us a little bit about the background. Interesting guy. Tune in next week for a new edition.